I'd like to welcome Dr. Steve Van Drew. Steve is a West Point engineering graduate with operations research graduate degrees from the Colorado School of Mines, a former Army officer, college professor, and cost estimator for the defense aerospace community, and has 25 years experience using at-risk for cost risk/uncertainty analysis. And today he is presenting WBS allocation. Steve?
Thanks, Chelsea. I am going to change one of the things that you mentioned, if you don't mind, and that is that I don't mind being interrupted by someone. So I'm probably not going to notice it on chat, but I'll stop periodically and peek, and maybe even if Chelsea's kind of paying attention, ask her if anything pressing has come in over chat for a question, because I'd hate to have you sitting there waiting for 35 minutes until Q&A opens up for something that could have been answered in the opening minutes. I just think it would go smoother, especially with a small audience, which we're kind of expecting today. So as Chelsea mentioned,
I'll pop in with any if I spot any questions.
All right, great, thank you. As Chelsea mentioned, today's topic is WBS allocation. And my slides don't want to advance. There we go. I've given a version of this presentation recently to a pretty large audience of mostly project managers, and I was amazed at the kind of questions they asked. It reminded me that, the audience is everything, and so I am expecting your questions to probably be more appropriate as cost estimators, but if you feel or are in a different career field, don't let that stop you from asking a question. When I gave this presentation to the PMs, though, I didn't call it WBS allocation as cost estimators refer to it. I called it fair share contingency determination, to try and give them a sense that there was some kind of allocation going on, and the intent of it was to be fair, and it really intrigued them. I think most of you, I'm guessing, as members of this organization, are aware of what WBS allocation is, and maybe just want to see a couple of different ways of doing it, maybe hear some of the arguments for why one way should be used or another, and to focus kind of on the tool approach, a spreadsheet approach to how you could implement a couple of these. So with that in mind, what I plan on going through is the following topics. First of all, just to make sure everybody understands what the fundamental issue is when we talk about allocating contingency reserve. And I'm calling it contingency reserve, although I'm very aware that different professions have different terminologies for it. Government versus industry calls it different things. And so we got to be careful about what we're calling it. I have chosen to call it contingency reserve here. And I'll make that a little clearer in a moment, exactly what I mean by that. Then I want to talk through a number of different approaches, just to expose you to the idea that there is no one way to do what I'm talking about today. There are a number of approaches that have been used or proposed to being used and have been tried. There's no universal agreement that I'm aware of on how this should be done. In fact, I pulled out my textbook on cost risk uncertainty analysis by Dr. Paul Garvey and went into his index this morning looking for every imaginable way of referring to this topic, and I finally found some pages listed under cost risk reserve, and I went in and read everything he had to say about it, and there was no math associated with it. There was no agreement on the approach that ought to be taken. So even the book, if you will, on this subject doesn't really talk to how it ought to be done. Just want to make that point. This is, like you're all, I'm sure, very aware, there's as much art to this business as there is science. I'll certainly be bringing some of the science into it, but the judgment, the art that goes into it is still present, and we just have to learn to live with that. I'm going to follow up a discussion of the different approaches that could be used by singling out a couple of them to demonstrate. Specifically, I want to demonstrate how to take simulation results, work with the variances of the inputs from those simulation results, and turn that into an allocation scheme. And then I'm going to show you one that at risk has a function that will allow us to do that gives slightly different results for the same fundamental idea, but it uses something called a contribution to variance approach. And I'll explain why that's different, why that gives different results, as well as show you what at-risk, since Palisade is the one sponsoring this showcase today, show you some of the other things that at-risk can give you access to for trying it. And then finally, I don't want to dismiss the fact that when you do this, there are other little nuances that can present complications to this approach, especially since my example is going to be a pretty straightforward WBS roll-up. I want to acknowledge that that's not how every cost estimate is going to appear. I'm also going to mention the fact that when correlation is included, it can complicate things, and some other things like that I'll talk about then. So with that in mind, let's get rolling. Here's the basic, come on slides, advance. What I'm calling the fundamental issue here is this. Let's say that you've taken kind of the standard approach and you know what your point estimate is, which, as I'm defining it to be for this webinar, it's just the output results when all the inputs are at their most likely value. So if it is a straight WBS roll-up, then what you're adding together are all most likely values. I'm very aware that a giant in our field, Dr. Steve Book, for years at DODCAS and ICEAA, now ICEAA conferences, presented a very popular topic every year called Do Not Sum Most Likely Costs. And here I am right in the beginning of this thing telling you that I'm referring to the point estimate as the sum of those most likelies. What Dr. Book, despite the title of that, what he was really saying was, don't pretend that when you sum the most likely costs together that you have what will ultimately become the most likely or modal value from your simulation run. So, I mean, it's a legitimate summation. It can be done and you get a number that is in fact a possible outcome of costs. Just don't refer to it as the most likely simply because it was the sum of most likelies. That may seem a little bit off topic, but I have to acknowledge that most of you are probably aware of Dr. Book and the paper that he presented over the years as a member of this organization. So I'm referring to that as the point estimate, the sum of most likelies. In most applications that I've seen, nearly every one, that ends up putting you find out when you've done a simulation, in the left side, sometimes very, very far into the tail even of the left of a final output distribution of costs. And you'll see in this example that kind of thing happens. There's a lot of reasons why that could be. Typically, the inputs that you get from most likelies tend to be overly optimistic and things like that. But especially acknowledging that that might be the case, you end up budgeting to some point beyond what the sum of those most likelies is. So the fundamental issue here is if you're budgeting at something past that point estimate, then you have to turn around and say, what do we do with those extra dollars? Because each of the cost elements have singled out a most likely value. You aren't budgeting to the sum of those, you're budgeting to something past that. The fundamental question becomes, how do I take that delta, that contingency reserve between what the sum of the most likelies is and where you've decided on the cumulative probability distribution to single out a value to call your budgeted amount? That difference in dollars is what I'm calling contingency reserve, and the issue is how to fairly allocate that back to those cost elements where the uncertainty exists, okay? And those are those uncertain cost elements, as you'll see in the example, can be in many applications just dollar amounts that are being rolled together for different, probably level 3 or even below, different WBS elements being rolled up that maybe are already all in dollars. And if that's the case, it's a question of how much do each of those elements get? It would be a simple matter to do a few things. Let's go see what my slides say. This is some of the possible approaches to this. For example, if you've got some kind of a corporate policy, or maybe if you're working for the government and what the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act says to do is to initially said to do, it's changed a little over the years, but it said to at least look at what's happening at the 80th percent from that cumulative probability distribution. And when you look at that 80th percent and compare it to your point estimate, there's going to be dollars available to allocate. If you set them aside as a contingency reserve, then instead of specifically saying, here's how much you get cost element A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, whatever you're calling them, if you keep them in reserve, the question becomes, how do you know when somebody's coming back to you? One of the cost element account or CAMs is coming back to you and saying, well, we've encountered some problems and we're going to need an amount, a plus up beyond our point estimate, our most likely value. How do you know when it's getting out of hand? And so even if you aren't physically allocating these dollar amounts back, what I'm advocating is knowing what those amounts might be to get everybody kind of singing the same tune in terms of your overall 80th percent or 70th, 75th, wherever you've decided to be. And in my example, this will make a lot more sense, but the fundamental idea here is you want to be fair. And I've got fair in quotes there because fair is going to be, in the eyes of the beholder, is fair from the point of view of the PM, from the point of view of the corporation, from, which stakeholder are you talking about? If fair is in terms of those CAMs or cost element managers, the team leads, whoever's in charge of those cost elements, from their perspective, fair might be something like a peanut butter spread, where you just say, okay, we've got $100,000 to spread over 10 elements. Each one of you gets $10,000. Yeah, that'll work. Maybe you call it the Oprah. You get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car. Maybe call it that kind of an approach. That would seem fair to the people executing the plan, but from other perspectives, it would seem kind of ridiculous. I mean, that might be fair to them, but it misses some fundamental points about why the program is risky to begin with. So maybe what you want to try and do is get every one of the cost elements an allocation to them where the dollars are different, but what you're trying to do is put each of those elements at about the same cumulative probability. It's a lot harder to do than it may sound, and I'll show you that in the demonstration as well. And this is something not obvious to everybody, probably is to everybody in this audience, but one of the fundamental counterintuitive things of statistics is you can't just add together all the cost elements 40th percentiles and expect to be overall at the 40th or the 80th or even the 50th. It just doesn't work that way. So finding some allocation that puts every one of the cost elements at about the same cumulative probability, in my experience, the only way I've really been able to do it efficiently is to use goal seek in a spreadsheet. But that could be an approach. It's a possible approach is what I'm saying here. Still, and although that in a way is going to go back and try and give everybody a fair cut at it, you still haven't acknowledged where the overall uncertainty is, which of the elements are driving the overall variability. And as soon as you start to think along those lines, you're going to jump to that second bullet where you want to go after probably the variance. Some people use standard deviation. I've had some people propose using CV instead, the coefficient of variation, which is just the standard deviation divided by the mean. And there could be other measures as well that you use. Variance, I believe, is the one I've seen more often than others. I don't know that there's a real strong argument for that being the principal way to do it. It may just be a favorite because mathematicians know that summing variances is a proper mathematical procedure. You're not supposed to add standard deviations and try and make anything out of that, but adding variances is a legitimate operation. So if that's the reason you prefer variance, then you've got an argument to make for sure. Standard deviation isn't being squared to get to variance. So in a way, by going for standard deviation instead, even though the sum of those standard deviations isn't a legitimate calculation, it might be a valid basis for proportioning. And you'll see what I'm talking about in my example in a moment. And then where at risk comes to play. Remember, this is a Palisade funded webinar. So to get kind of the at risk, what it will provide you with, if you go that route, is some different forms of sensitivity analysis or tornado graphs. And the one that I'm specifically going to demonstrate is a contribution to variance. So it sounds like it's the same thing as doing what the second bullet is, where you focus on the elements variance, but there's a subtle difference in there that I'll explain, and it does lead to some slight dollar differences, even in my simple little example. So these are possible approaches, and I'm sure there's others. This is just a first cut maybe at what those might be. All right. Chelsea didn't mention it, but you should be able to find the files, both the PowerPoint that I'm briefing from, as well as the spreadsheet I'm going to open up and do live with you in a moment. But before jumping in there and maybe having you get lost, I wanted to kind of show you how to navigate through the spreadsheet, what I'm going to be showing you. In its simplest form, it's just a WBS roll-up of these 9 cost elements. This was a ground test. I won't tell you where or who, but the numbers are even legit from some time ago. These are dollars and thousands, and the starting point for this, everything in yellow is a user input. So it's a 3-input estimate. There's no, and you can tell from this particular presentation that there must not be data backing this up, that it is a subjectively assessed set of inputs, 9 different inputs, where if we go to the system requirements, the static test, fatigue test, the T&E support, if we go to each of those leads and ask them for a most likely, a low and a high with some kind of specificity about what we mean by low and high, then you might be tempted to just call this a triangular distribution or a trigen or maybe a PERT distribution. And that's not what this webinar is about, although we could spend a lot of time just focusing on how to decide whether to do a 1090 trigen or any of the others. I want you to know, and it's the reason it's kind of this lavender color on top, I've gone with just straight triangulars here. Okay, so the most likely sum up to 144.1 million. That is what I would refer to as the point estimate. The lows are here. You can sum those up. I mean, I've summed them up. I've provided you with a 109 million for all the lows, and all the highs being added together give us a 220, call it 222 million. So there's basically a doubling between the sum of the lows and the sum of the highs. I know from having run enough simulations that I'm not going to come anywhere near 109 million when I run a simulation of this. The chance of all 9 coming in at their absolute minimum, it's possible, but it's virtually, it's highly, highly, highly unlikely. Same thing with all the highs. So I'm expecting when I run the simulation for those bounds to tighten up. I don't know where that 144 is going to show up on my final S-curve when I run the simulation. What I can tell, and I've told you this in the call-out box, all of these lavender at-risk distributions, which are the inputs to the simulation I'm going to demonstrate, they're all presenting you with the mean, the expected value from the triangles. And if you look carefully at these, you'll see that every one of them is a right skewed distribution, which is kind of why I have they're not the same right skew. I haven't just taken 0.8 of the most likely and 1.4, for example. These are values that were assessed separately, not factored off of the most likely. So some of them may be fairly symmetric, others may be strongly right skewed, but they are all right skewed distributions. And the significance of that is the mean of the triangles is therefore greater than the most likely in every single case. Okay? So when I sum all of the means together, now I'm starting to think about a central limit theorem application. And without getting into all the details of this, if I genuinely believe that the central limit theorem applied here, which says that I have enough of these, 9's not going to be enough, that are all approximately the same order of magnitude, and they roughly are, although this one's a little bit, Avionics Integration does stand out somewhat. They're approximately the same order of magnitude. I'm treating these as independent, although if I were really doing this estimate, I would include correlation. Wouldn't matter how these are distributed. If I believe the central limit theorem applied, then I could call the sum of the means the mean of a normally distributed final cost. Then I would also take the variances for each of these, sum them up, and treat that as the variance of that normal distribution if I believe the central limit theorem applied. So that's something to have in the back of your mind. I have a couple of things here that are leading me to believe that this may not, in fact, lead us to something that's close enough to normal to blow off the simulation. I would feel more comfortable with simulation results. So the colors that you'll see in the spreadsheet, just to say it again, the yellows are input by the user, the modeler. The lavender color here, that light purple color, are input distributions for my at-risk simulation. This summation here in that cell is going to be the output from the simulation result. We're looking at a static sum right now of just the means. I do expect when I run the simulation for the mean of the simulation results to be right in that same neighborhood of about $158.5 million. So let's see if that happens. With that in mind, let's jump into the spreadsheet. And here it is, and it's going to appear a little small to you right now, and I'm tempted to blow it up, but I do know, and I need to tell you, that I've got a lot of columns and even a row hidden here for kind of presentation purposes. This is the same thing you were looking at a moment ago. If you've never worked with at-risk, that's the ribbon that you see at the top of my spreadsheet right now. This red and blue ribbon is the at-risk ribbon. At-risk is an add-in to Excel. And if I click in any of these cells, you can see that the syntax starts equals at-risk something. So if I double light it up, you can see that I'm pulling in the low, the most likely, and the high values. I'm pulling in the name from under the cost element. So there's no secret there about what it's doing. It's pulling in name, low, most likely, and high, and treating that as a triangularly distributed input. There are 9 of these. They're all triangular. They all follow the same scheme, left to right, top to bottom kind of construction. And there we are looking at that 158 sum of those. That is an output cell. I had to tell at-risk that was my output, so when I run the simulation, it knows what to keep the statistics on. There's one other color that you're going to start seeing in a moment in this spreadsheet as I unhide things, and that's kind of that tannish, that brown-orange color, if you will. These are a number of at-risk statistic functions that I want to demonstrate because in my mind, they really give you extra power to the spreadsheet that you may not be aware of. And if you're a user of one of the other packages, this might be one of the things that convinces you that at-risk is maybe the way to go. Starting with, let me unfold for you what's happening in column E. Go in and unhide that. What I've done here is, this is a little bit different way of making the same point of why this isn't even an issue, why we're having a webinar on this topic today. There's a function, and you can see from that being the tan colors, there's a theoretical function that pulls out of the triangular distribution that I'm employing where the most likely occurs, and that's what I'm asking it to do. It's called the risk theo x to p. So the x that I'm working with is that most likely value, and it's pulling it out of the triangular distribution. X to P, the X is in cell G3, that's where the triangular is, and I'm specifically interested in what the probability is of being at or below 20,261 out of this triangular distribution. In other words, where are the 9 most likelies in their triangles? And you see that, here we're in about a third for a lot of them, even all the way down to 25, 22%. This one is not a sum of those. This is, and I'm going to show you again real quickly. Look at the one above it. It says risk theo x to p. In this cell, it's a function also, but it's not theoretical this time. It is simulation results. I've already run the simulation. It's looking into the output cell and finding out for that overall simulation result, which is going on in this cell, what probability is there of being at or below the sum of those most likelies? And it is 4%. That's why this is even such a big deal. The reason we don't budget to the sum of the most likelies, I don't know that I can make a stronger point than what this is showing right here. Even if you're okay being at about a third for a lot of these, even if you think that confidence in the results is okay, When all of them are included together, at least in an uncorrelated sense, that sum of the most likelies is sitting at the 4% cumulative probability level from the overall at-risk simulation results. That's scary. That's why cost estimators don't budget to the sum of the most likelies. It also then opens up the problem for us. If we're going to budget to something else, something higher than the 4%, which is what the planning numbers call for, then we're going to have to do some kind of allocation. All right, so there we are looking at that basic fundamental issue again. Probably a good time right now to ask if there's any questions. I don't want to go much further and lose people if you aren't with me so far. Doesn't look like there's anything in the chat session. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead then. So, to understand what at-risk does for a simulation, if you've never seen it done before, this button on the toolbar is a toggle between looking at, in these lavender cells, the triangular distributions, looking at the static values as opposed to random values. If I click on that die, you should have noticed all of those numbers change. And not only do they all change, but then the sum changed. If I sit here on my computer, on my laptop, and go function F9, you'll see that all 9 of those are being randomly sampled from again, and therefore the sum changes. What the at-risk simulation does for as many iterations as I ask it to do is to basically sit there going F9, 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 thousands of times, recording the results of what happens in G12, and then presenting us with the statistical summary of that. Okay, so that's a good way of seeing what's going to happen, and kind of, especially when the simulation runs, I like to have it set on the die being on so that you can see the numbers rifling through. Kind of gives you a sense that, yeah, it's really running. Take the dice back off so we know what we're looking at. Now we're looking at all expected values, and we're seeing that the sum of the means is putting us at that 158 million. So let's see what comes next. I'm going to open up the next set of columns here. And when I do that, you see a whole lot more statistics functions being used. So I'm going to have to explain what I've done here. Let's start with the mean. I didn't need this necessarily for anything, but it is interesting to see from a point of view of, and I really don't mean to badmouth anybody here, but there are a lot of people who believe that that you should budget to the 50th percent, that ought to be the way everybody does business. And I wanted to demonstrate pretty quickly, even in this small real world example, that if we were to budget to the means, there they are. The means in this case are all past the 50th percent. Okay, that's the nature of the right skew. The mean of the final distribution is going to be son of a gun if it isn't the same thing. Well, that makes sense. That's just telling me that the means out of the theoretical distribution match to what the calculated means are going to be. So that's no surprise there. It's these percentages that I thought maybe you'd be interested in seeing. If I budget to all of the means from the triangles, does that put me at the 50th percent? Well, I don't know, because I can't add those together and really tell you where I'm at. I can't take that number and just assume it's at the 50th percent. That's one of those things we'd have to study and find out. All right, if you're with the color scheme so far, column J, the next one over, there's an entry at the top of this. It's 80% right now, and I want you to see where that gets used. In column J, for the 9 cost elements, I'm using a new stat function. It's a P to, it doesn't say Theo, it says equals risk P to X. So that's a function that is not basing its percentage on the triangular distribution's theoretical values. It's pulling the 80th percent out of what's happened in the simulation. Okay? And that's an important distinction here. I would rather, especially if this is a more complicated model and I don't necessarily have a full awareness of all the traceability to things that are affecting this number, I would want to work with the simulated results as opposed to the theoretical. So that's what I'm doing here. If I change this to a 0.7, a 0.6, 0.5, I can change it to anything I want, and the stat function is going to pull out of the simulated results for the triangle whatever percent I want to look at. So why am I doing this? I'm going to talk you through how to construct the 80th percent, an allocation to the 80th percent. So to do that, you might think, well, let's just budget every one of those nine cost elements at their 80th percent. And this function tells me what that would be. If I add those together, I'm at 179, call it $180 million. Well, does that put me at the 80th overall is the question, and the answer is it doesn't. It puts you past that, and I'll show you that in a moment. But this is a way of demonstrating to you. The reason I have it lined out is it's not what you think it is. The sum of the 80th percents doesn't put you at the 80th percent overall. Statistics just doesn't work that way. If it did, it would be a simple matter of just sitting here going, well, where do you want to be on the overall? Do you want to be at the 70th? Type in a 0.7 there, and all those numbers update. 80th is kind of a common one. There it is. There are the results. This is not how you would do it. This is to demonstrate that it doesn't put you where you think it does. So let's go to the next column over in K. This is pulling in the variances. Now, I could have calculated the theoretical variance from the triangles. Same kind of reasoning applies here. I think it's more appropriate, especially once you start with more complex models, to work with the simulated variances. So what it's doing is pulling in the variance results, calculated variances from the simulation results for each of these 9 cost elements. Okay? There those are. If I sum those together, you get that total. So let's talk about that for a second. Many of you are using an approach like this. In fact, I'm aware that one of the syscoms I've worked with, they're about to roll out a new tool that does exactly this. That this is its approach to WBS allocation. I think it is a pretty common one, especially for people who are building their own spreadsheets and doing it. It's a fairly straightforward thing to do. Some of you are basing this on the theoretical variance out of the different distributions you're using. So in other words, go back to the triangle and get the actual as opposed to the simulated one. There's going to be some slight differences, okay? But in this case, with these 9 variances adding up to that grand total, if I go in and proportion and want to set up a proportion for allocating that follows a scheme that says let's allocate to the elements in proportion to the variance that they exhibit, then here are the proportions. So this is just taking the individual variance, dividing by the sum of the variances. That's all this is doing. It better, and it does, sum to a full 1/0. So what the allocation then does, and I'll show you the math for this one, it takes that proportion that you're after, and it goes in and allocates the amount that's showing in cell M. Well, I have M13. I know that's a new row we need to unhide. Here we go. So let's unhide that and see what I've tucked away in that row. There we go. So I need to back up a step. So bear with me, please. So let's go back to column J. In cell J13, I've asked for the 80th percent of the simulation results. And I really should have shown you this when I was showing you that those 80ths, which sum up to that amount, the true 80th coming out of the simulation results is like $14.5 million less than what the sum of the 80ths is. So this is an important function to have seen, and that value becomes pivotal for us in the next step. So I'm sorry I skipped over that. Maybe I should have left the row open all along, but you wouldn't have known initially what all those different stats functions were doing. So this one is going in to the simulation results. It's picking off from the output cell in G2, it's picking off the 80th percent. And I'll show you that graphically in a moment. But it's at the 165, call it 165.6 million, as opposed to what the sum of our most likelies was, which is 144.1 million. The difference between being at the 80th and the sum of the most likelies is this $21.5 million over here. And so that's what I've done. This amount right there that I want to allocate is the difference between the percentage out of the overall, the cumulative probability from the overall cost minus the sum of the most likelies, that point estimate, if you will. Tells me that my challenge here is to figure out how to allocate 21.5 million. So if I follow this scheme, then it's simply a matter of multiplying each of the 9 proportions by that total. And when I do that, you find out that the first element, and there it is to show that's what I've done, the first proportion of about 14% times the 21.5 million says that we're going to allocate to system requirements a little over 3 million. Almost 4 million there, almost 4 million here, almost 6 million for avionics integration on down the line. And sure enough, when you sum those up, you get right back to that grand total of your reserve again. So this 21.5 million is what I've been referring to as the contingency reserve. So what are, and this is, I need to say this again, these are dollars that the program manager should be left in control of. I mentioned in my abstract for this talk that we don't want to open people up to gaming the situation, and gaming would involve taking it, if you take this and give it back to the control account manager who initially told you 20,261 and you say, nah, I don't believe you, I'm going to give you another 3 million. They're going to start gaming that system, and you know, you do it a few times and the games get played. So maybe what the approach is, and this will depend on whether you're government or contractor and a whole lot of other things, the approach might be, PM, you maintain the 21.5 million, and all I'm doing when I calculate this is saying, hey, don't be surprised if system requirements comes back and asks you for about 3 million more. Okay, that would be consistent with a fair share kind of proportioning of the contingency reserve that puts us at an overall 80%. And it would be equivalent to budgeting that cost element to the sum of those two. They're most likely plus that amount. Now, whether you physically budget that to them or not, I think most people would say, no, don't give it to them. Let them work to what they gave as the most likely. Just don't be surprised if they come ask for that up to that much. But the question then I would have as a cost estimator is, what did I do for each of those in terms of their individual budgeted amounts? I know overall I'm at the 80th percent, but what did I do individually to these? And now you see why going in and doing some kind of peanut butter approach doesn't get us the same results as this. We have ranges here from in the mid to high 40s up to, we've got a couple that have broken through the 70% range. And none of them are past the 80th, and yet overall we're at the 80th percent now. That's why mathematically this is such a fun, and I'm really going to say fun, such a fun, challenging thing to work on. Okay. This is a fairly common, fairly straightforward way to do it. Not the only one for sure. Like I said, maybe you want something that puts all of those at about the same percentage. It's not the 80th percent. You saw over here, doing all of them at the 80th would put you to at 180 million overall, which is an extra $15 million compared to what this approach would have done. So there's mathematically some challenges here. I do have more columns open up, and I want to show you those fairly quickly. This is what I do because I have at risk. I'm using an approach instead that uses something called sequential contribution to variance. It is one of at risk's half a dozen or so different sensitivity approaches. I've run the simulation. Simulation results are here. You can see the S-curve. You can see where the 80th percent overall was at 165 million. You can see that that we were, with our point estimate, we were between we're down just a little under 5%. And then the tornado diagram that's being shown here, and I've got a better view of it on this one. Tornado diagram here says that Avionics Integration, in terms of contribution to variance, is the risk driver at a little over to 27, looks like 27.6%. So most of you, if you'd asked for this tornado diagram, would go, well, where do those numbers come from? They follow a scheme called contribution to variance. I wanted to show you what that is kind of in the spreadsheet here. So remember that first one that we looked at was that to the Avionics Integration 27.6%. There it is in cell R7. Avionics Integration, its sequential contribution to variance, using the stat function that I've pulled out of at risk, is saying that was the overall largest in terms of rank individual variance. And when at risk does and I'm going to say this without trying not to get too mathematical, it does a stepwise regression to make sure all of these genuinely 9 elements belong in a multiple regression equation. Then it goes back and one at a time adds them in the order that's portrayed here. And in that order, it then measures their contribution to R squared. So the first one, the R, if I ran a regression equation between just Avionics Integration and all of the simulation results, the R squared would come in at 27.6. When I go and add the second variable, which is this one here, because it's rank 2, it kicks it up by that much more. And these have been normalized to put them back on a 1.0 basis. But they start out as contributions to the R squared and then get normalized. So when all 9 of them have been added back in and you're just measuring their contribution to the R squared's measurement, then this is what you end up with for percentages. So I wanted to show you there's a slight difference in here between what these are. Avionics Integration, for example, 27.6%. You see if we follow this scheme, it's 26.2%. Small differences there. This approach would say to allocate almost 6 and budget it to there, which would put you at that. It's a 312, those are dollars and thousands. So it's a $313,000 difference following this scheme shown in columns Q through U and using the at-risk results. If you look at this function and you see the syntax of it gets a little complicated. Here's the dialog box for it. And what you may not know if you've never worked with at-risk is you can go in and if you don't like what contribution to variance is doing, you can go in here and choose one of the others. And you see when I put the cursor in the analysis type, I can base this allocation scheme on regression, on a mapped value approach to regression, on straight correlation, and you have a choice there whether you're doing the Pearson or the Spearman rank order approach, or the one that I just demonstrated, sequential contribution to variance. So 4 different approaches there that you could use to do an allocation, and all I have to change is whether I was using a 1, 2, 3, or 4 in here in that function to do it. So the idea there was just to demonstrate this is not the only way to do it. If you've got something like at-risk with its own dedicated stats functions to giving you sensitivity analysis like at-risk does, you've got access to a whole bunch of other approaches you might want to take to this. Now let's go back to the slides then, and I'll kind of wrap it up for us. So here's what we talked through for the model itself, and now you've seen it live, and this is fundamentally what we just demonstrated. I had a point estimate of 144 million. I ran a simulation. The simulation results plot out this S curve. The 80th percent, 0.8 probability hits the S curve there, and that puts me at the 165, 166 million. The delta between those two is what we're referring to as contingency reserve. Okay. Here was the allocation scheme I presented, the first one. So this is calling out and giving you a little more insight into where those numbers have come from again, just kind of to tie it back together in slides. Then I told you I'd talk about some complications to this. I did not run this as a very complicated WBS roll-up. Only 9 elements. All of them were right-skewed distributions. The first complication might be, what happens if you end up with some that are left-skewed instead of right-skewed, where the most likely value that subjective input has put you at ends up being above what my approach would have given you. Are you going to take money away from that cam? Are you going to take money away from that element and say, no, I don't think that's where you're going to be at? Well, that's a conscious decision. Whether you say, whether you let them stand pat on their most likely value, even if it's higher than what you would have funded them at. If you have a policy that says, no, we'll leave you at your most likely value when that happens, well, they're not a candidate now for that allocation. So you've got to have some kind of an if statement maybe or something like that in your logic of your allocation that says whether or not they're included in it. Do you still fund them to their most likely, or do you actually take money away from them? So that left-skewed uncertainty distribution, those triangles that I gave for all 9 being right-skewed, if some had been left-skewed, this could have presented itself to us, and we would have to have made some judgment call about what to do there. I'll leave that to you to decide what to do, of course, since you're building your own models, but I will caution you that I don't think taking money away from them is the right thing to do. That would result in some unintended consequences that you may not be after. In fact, what I think in the case of subjective inputs to our estimates, what we really are hoping for is for people to give us less optimistic most likelies. So if you turn around and start taking money away from the people who have tried to be less optimistic with you, you're really speaking out of both sides of your mouth. And that's all I'm going to say on that one. The next possible complication could be the way that the cost elements got constructed. Mine were straight dollars. Okay, I gave a low, a most likely, and a high for all 9 of the triangles, and we just added them together. That's not really how I build cost estimates, at least. For example, those dollars, it may be the simplest thing, would have just said, what if it's a rate times a number of hours? You know, dollars per hour times hours. And you are modeling the dollars per hour as some input probability with its own distribution times the number of hours, which is also uncertain. So how are you going to handle that then? The units of measure, when you go to look at your rack and stack of what you've done, you've got at least one element in there where you've got dollars per hour and you've got hours then being rolled up with a bunch of dollars. So the units of measure can give you an issue to deal with. So be careful of that. I prefer modeling uncertainty at the root cause because it's easier to mitigate then. It's easier to understand what it's going to take to mitigate it if you're looking deeper into why. One of the things that risk can do for you, and you've probably never heard of this before, but it's a real handy feature in at-risk called risk make input. I can take that dollars per hour distribution times the hours distribution and join those two together so that as the simulation runs, it's actually treating the product of those two probability distributions as its own input. It's now in dollars. I can use that when I go to allocate. I still would have to do a little thinking to turn that back into dollars per hour, an allocation of dollars per hour and an allocation to the hours themselves. But at the straight roll-up amount, it would clean things up a bit to be able to use a feature like this risk make input. Okay. And the last one is the whole idea of unintended consequences. I really am after inputs that are unbiased. Things like I want to get them to stop being so optimistic. How do you encourage that when you're going to turn around and then plus them all up anyway? You know, you start getting into the gamesmanship there. And this would open us up to all kinds of discussion about cognitive behavior, about intentionally trying to make sure a project stays alive and things like that. My caution here, the reason I included a bullet on this was to tell you that this just adds another reason for them to possibly game it. If you suspect them of doing it now, wait till they hear or find out that you're doing some kind of allocation of the reserve. They'll see if there aren't ways they can game that as well. Just something to think about. And with that in mind, I'm gonna ask Chelsea what questions we have, but please, if you've never worked with at-risk before and are not on an NMCI or any of the other government lockdown computers, or maybe your own company doesn't lock things down, or maybe you're still telecommuting and have access to your personal computer, you can go get a 15-day trial version of at-risk free by going to the website I've given here on this page. Free trial version, as well as access to all kinds of additional free webinars and other things. Palisade doesn't require you to own a version of at-risk to get access to all their things, but you do have to fill out a brief form so they can send you annoying emails trying to get you to buy it. But that's just the game they're playing. So thank you for your attention. What kind of questions have we got, Chelsea?
So no questions so far.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, if there's none so far, there's none, period, because we're done.
All right. Well, if any of you have any questions for Steve, there's his information on the slide. Oh, there is one question that just came in from Scott. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, Scott. Sure can.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Great presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Drew. Question is, it looked like the confidence levels at the end after the allocation varied quite a bit. So is there kind of a modification that you could make so that you're kind of shooting for the confidence levels at the end to be the same? You know what I mean? Could that be another approach? I
absolutely know what you mean. And you know, it's funny you should ask that, because I really thought that was the right way to do it myself initially. When I first sat down to kind of tackle this problem, that seemed like the right thing to do. The problem with it is that it may seem fair, and mathematically and visually, it's going to look more appealing, but what it leaves out is the source of the overall riskiness. The 9 elements are not equally risky. And so to put them at the same percentage, the same confidence, the same cumulative probability in their individual distributions might be appealing, and it still is intuitively to me. But I've since learned that the thing it really misses out on is the fact that the contributions of each of those 9 are not equal. You know, and you saw that in that avionics integration one. If we went back to that and looked, the tornado diagram, now it's not letting me out. Do I still have control of my screen, Chelsea?
Yep, we still see your slot, your thank you.
Yeah, I'm trying to pull out of it. It doesn't seem to want to let me out. Well, I'll have to talk without getting back into the spreadsheet though. But if you look on the output tab, if you've downloaded my file for the spreadsheet, even without at-risk, you can see the report that it generated. If you look at that tornado diagram, that in terms of contribution to variance, where variance is a measure of riskiness, the variance of that overall cost, the contributions of each of those 9 elements is not the same. So trying to put them all on an equal footing in terms of that confidence or cumulative probability, as appealing as it might seem, misses that. It misses the idea that, hey, avionics integration is the one that's going to bite us first. Let's take care of that one the most.
Yep, gotcha. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
No other questions, but we do have a few comments. Dakota Hogan says, thanks for the great presentation. And then David Berry says, great presentation. I have at-risk available here at work, and he will be looking into using it, and thank you.
Great. Hope everybody's staying safe out there. Whatever state you're living in, it's kind of strange that we've all got different guidance, even though the CDC puts out one thing, every state implements it a little differently. I traveled last week and saw 4 different states worth of how they're managing it. Wherever you are, stay safe.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks, everyone.